Sounds good. Well, first of all, thank you for having me, guys. I guess, I'll kind of give a bit of a backstory and talk a bit about how this came about. But, you know, there is I mean, from my career and from peers in being in cyber leadership, there is a common themes, there is a common stories that I have been sharing over the last, 3 months or so. As I've been saying just before we started, I think it's amassed a massive amount of response. I think, as I said, I've got probably 1.5 million impressions from the last 60 days or so from just some of the stories and some of the, I guess, broken stuff that I see in a leadership context currently. So I created this slideshow and essentially wanted to discuss and talk about why this is happening, what we can do about it, and just, I guess, call out some of the common stories. So, the message is, the CISO paradox is kind of we have a liability or without authority. Why modern security leadership is broken and the path to kind of fixing it. I think the main message is what it says underneath it, and it kind of perfectly, I guess, sums up in a way that it almost feels like, companies don't really want security. They want the appearance of security. CISOs are being hired to not necessarily to prevent breaches, but they are hired to absorb blame. And where the message comes out is the theme, and I think what I discussed in my post was that you often see, whether it's job descriptions or even talking from interviews, the main goal of a CISO job is to appear and put a name on an insurance paper, to be a name that sits on a client contracts, to be the name that is on any compliance requirements, and you are there to essentially tick the boxes without actually improving and maturing the organization's cybersecurity posture and addressing the cyber risks. It becomes skewed, and I think it's that kind of reason mostly is because often security is viewed as a cost or a cost center. And, I'm sure, there are many of us are great security leaders, but I think the common theme is probably between the two problems that I see is board and executive education about understanding what cyber is and what it does for companies. But also, I think another dilemma that we often face, I often get asked by, you know, aspirational cyber leaders is, how do I become a CISO? How do I become a cyber leader? And, there is no course, there is no path that you complete and you are a CISO overnight. Uh, and the problem is normally that most of us came through a fairly technical route. And all of a sudden, when you are thrust in a position where you are facing against the board and the leadership, your communication, your influencing, and your storytelling skills are tested to the max. And whenever people, I think, struggling with this side of the role, they often fall back to their strength, which is the technical ability. So, we're gonna discuss and call out some of the common examples and what we see in this industry, and hopefully, it'll be useful for you guys to, and you'll probably hear some common stories that probably some of you might even faced. But that's the kind of the preface of the story. So if we go into the next slide, and as I discussed, the kind of the common job description that nowadays appears in whenever organizations are trying to hire a CISO, they want a unicorn at, as as the headline suggests, they want a unicorn at donkey prices. Job descriptions that ask for 15 years worth of experience, obviously all of the list of acronyms and spaghetti of certifications, technical expertise, someone who can manage firewalls and report to the board and build AppSec programs and know networking security and things like that. But obviously for the minimal price. And the problem is, as the previous message says, is, uh, in a way, it feels like companies are trying to hire one sort of hack wizard to manage everything. Become a technical person, a leadership person, and sort of market reality says that average CISO tenure nowadays is 18 to 24 months, even if we are successful to reach that long. Now, and I think the problem is that, as I mentioned earlier, I think most organizations don't really understand or know why they need a CISO and what a good CISO does for them. I often talk about red flags. If a CISO requirement or need for a CISO appears based on audit requirements, that is often a big red flag. Just because an auditor says you need a CISO doesn't not always mean that you actually need a CISO. So it requires organization to evolve culturally and think about going down the secure maturity route. Security program, yes, it needs investment, it needs understanding and support. That's why I always talk about a one common theme that I discuss with cyber leaders, how to have a sort of a gun in the arsenal is a cybersecurity charter. Now, what the charter normally does and what it tries to achieve is to split that line between accountability and responsibility. So the common charter, what I discuss with is, you say that the CEO and the board is ultimately accountable for cybersecurity, but they can outsource the responsibility of the program to a CISO. And then the key point is there, we call out what do we need from the board and executives in order to achieve success in our cyber program. Things like, budget, team-wise. I often call out things like, at every project initiation, security has to be involved from day one. Because how can we help, secure projects if we're not aware when they are happening? And I think the other point which I often talk about, and it's one of the most important ones to call out there is, sometimes, or probably most of the times, security are at odds with IT. So there is a point in the security charter that mentions about IT can never block access to anything, because security, in order to assess any of the infrastructure or IT estate, needs to have access in order to assess and evaluate and audit the requirements. Because I'm sure you've been in a situation where IT is blocking access and you can't evaluate something because you don't know what security holes are in there. So that's kind of one of the, I guess, weapons for you to use in your arsenal to, first of all, make the leadership accountable, and you get them to sign off on the charter. So if we look at next, kind of a bit of a story in the background of why these job specs sometimes lead to this kind of disaster, is that it's kind of a prophecy here, but I'm sure people heard about the stories about 3 envelopes. This is kind of, I guess, different take of the story, where is day one, prophecy in inbox. So you land the role and you get an email from previous CISO, or the message left from previous CISO, and it said something along the lines that congratulations on the role, but here's the truth, and I think I often talk about how to conduct interview, because interviews is always a two-way street. But no CEO or no board or any of the executives gonna tell you all of the truth. They will promise you resources, but you won't get them. They will say security is a priority, but it's actually not. And the incident that you warned them about actually will happen, and they won't remember that you warned them about. And obviously PS, it says I lasted 19 months, so set a timer. And we often are naive that think thanks, it will be different for me. But narrators, as it says, it was not different. So why I'm explaining this, I guess the point is, you need to do the due diligence. I kind of, when I made the post, I often talked about, and that's why I mentioned that, the interviews are always a two-way street, but you need to be diligent in doing the research and understanding, how we uncover red flags. Did the company go through 5 CISOs over the 5 years? That's a big, massive red flag. You know, talk to the previous CISO who left. Why did they leave? Did they went on to new opportunities, or they left because they, battled and battled and lost eventually, where security culture never improved and all of the recommendations were neglected. Now, again, there's always the two sides of the story, and sometimes, whether it's is it a CISO communication problem, or is it a executive, bias and sort of didn't want to listen to you problem. So there's two ways about it, but you need to do the digging and understanding to get there. Now, I think the biggest problem that we normally face, and I'll talk a bit about where, kind of how I see this cybersecurity sort of bandwagon cycle appear again and again. But normally, security success is invisible. Our success means nothing bad happens. Whenever something bad happens, that obviously is very visible. So how do we, often, the post was, and the message is that, you can prevent, what it says under the iceberg, from masses of phishing attempts and malware infections and data exfiltration attempts. But whenever something bad happens, you'll be always questioning, how did this happen? What isn't that why we have a CISO? And that's the problem. How do we showcase our success when that success is invisible? And that's, I want to pull on that thread and talk a bit about, whenever we present to the board or wherever we, talk about our program, normally, we're talking a lot about the future and what we need to the future in order to achieve success. But I think it's important to whether have a slide or have some kind of information to showcase, how did we get here? Because the problem is, often, you'll get asked by executives and you'll be questioned, why do we need more money to spend on security? We didn't have an incident in the last 3 years. But that's precisely the reason why we didn't have. And I think we need to be able to, again, it goes back to storytelling. It's narrating the successes and actually showcasing why we didn't have an incident, how we can celebrate the wins, the invisible wins, to make it visible, to make leaders and business executives and the boards to understand how much work went in there and why nothing bad happened. So it's just something probably for you guys to think about, whenever we talk about, I know the time's normally limited with the boards and executives, but we definitely need a way, because and I'm talking about the cycle. I'm sure most of us heard the story, but the problem is, like, whenever you don't have incidents, say 3-4 years, executives often start thinking, why are we spending on security? Why don't we just make the team redundant, outsource everything? And that's when inevitable bad things happen. And then we start the cycle again, and then we start building the program from scratch. And I see this often, companies go through these 4 or 5 year cycles where, nothing bad happens. They outsource some of the team, make redundancies, and then eventually bad things happens. And then, we scramble to get back to where we were before. So I think we have a way and a duty to showcase and celebrate the wins, those invisible wins, to the businesses, to the boards, and to all of the executives. Now, I wanted to talk a bit about the cyber insurance trap. This one of the other posts, I think, which kind of attracted a lot of heated exchanges. But I mentioned kind of the last year premium was 45K, but this year's premium is 89K, and obviously there's a 97% increase. But we didn't have any incidents, and we improved our posture. Why is our premiums going up? And I think the reality is, as it says on the left, we're paying for other companies' bad security, and in some ways, I think, as you can see, kind of under the magnifying glass, the exclusions is that problem is that insurance in some ways is no longer really a protection, it's just a compliance checkbox. And I see where bigger organizations are actually, scrapping insurance and investing in in their cyber programs, because the chances are insurance won't pay out. So it's interesting analogy, and I think it's sometimes to think about. Obviously, there are great insurance brokers and there are bad ones, and I think sometimes probably need to walk around, because obviously I've seen a lot of successes as well in the same field, where if you get a knowledgeable broker who understands cyber controls and understands how our posture improvements should reduce the premiums, instead of just a compliance questionnaire checkbox. Actually, people who can evaluate and assess your controls and actually work with you, then insurance can be probably a benefit. But it's just it's one of the trends that I wanted to pull out and discuss and kind of probably ally to it. But we'll jump into the next story. And this story essentially is again sort of how we often see things, and how it's important to follow up on things and I guess coach boards and executives. The kind of the crux of the message is that a deal comes in, and obviously VP of sales says, we need SOC 2 in 30 days to close this 2 million deal. And obviously you as a CISO say, look, this SOC 2 is not something you can do overnight. It takes anywhere from 6 to 12 months, and we already discussed this 14 months ago. But because there was no deal in the pipeline, it was neglected. And it's often the question, why is security blocking the revenue? And the message then becomes, how can we showcase the benefit? And that's where I think that the real importance is, where I discussed earlier. Security is often viewed as a cost center, but if we can create a powerful narrative and story, how initiatives such as SOC 2 can help us gain new clients, expand into the new regions, show customer and client trust in our security investments, they bring tangibles and intangible benefits to organization. But it's how do we connect and create that powerful story? And it's not only CISO. I often talk about relationships across business units. How we can help a number of business units across the whole business. So this is a benefit to whether it's business development, to reach new clients and new deals. The outcome usually is, that obviously, we need to rush it because, we've been neglecting it earlier. And obviously now we're losing 2 million deal because we can't do a SOC, in 30 days. But, this was mentioned. And sometimes, I talked a bit, I think, in some of the posts, is making sure that we have documented our efforts and we can show that actually, we asked before for it. And how can we change someone's mind with a powerful influencing story? Now, the climax of the math that actually doesn't work. I guess this is a bit of a different story, but again, T minus 11 months. So 11 months ago, CISO recommends, a patch that, costs 60 grand, but it's denied and deprioritized. And then all of a sudden, yesterday, the breach occurs via unpatched vulnerability. And obviously, we have 1.8 million incident. Now, this is, I guess, the powerful story is of risk quantification and how building that story is important. Chances are, obviously, sometimes you'll get denied because of various other reasons. But I think the message becomes so much easier when we flip the numbers and go from 5x5 matrices to actually saying, look, we're spending 60K potentially to reduce the incident impact by millions. Now, whenever you put that into numbers, I guess, the numbers and the story paint a completely different picture. And it's not easy to get there because based on your maturity, I often say, I often, memorize an important story. I was once in a room from a very big bank CISO who said, oh, the way we do cyber risk quantification, we got 100 data scientists running Monte Carlo simulations, and I've got one GRC guy in a corner. But I think, it's important message to really understand your business. How does your business make money? What are you making, whether it's hourly, whether it's daily, so you can quantify, if a breach, if a vulnerability potentially has an impact and an incident that could could leave us exposed or could be, cause a downtime of a couple of days. Well, you can quantify that pretty easily. So that's something, I guess, on that journey to invest time to really understand. For example, I work in financial services, and it took me some time to understand, for example, how we make money from, doing loans for devices. And, it's not straightforward and it's not that easy, but investing time, whether it's sitting to finance director, to your CFO and things like that, to really understand what's going on behind the scenes, going to be really helpful for you. Now, kind of pulling on the same thread that we discussed previously, accountability without empowerment. And I guess, the message here, and I guess I wanted to probably, wanted to hear maybe from you guys in the chat and the messages. I was on a few podcasts recently, and when we were discussing this, my posts about CISO resignation letters and things like that, and the main theme and the question, I guess, came about is, CISOs, I guess, love a challenge. They love going into organizations that, it's quite tricky, and, they love a challenge to fix and repair things and make posture improvements. But I guess, when you are, as we, call out the chief information sort of scapegoat officer, or, you have 100% of responsibility, but you are, or you can't have no empowerment, but you are 100% accountable, where you can't block risky projects, you can't enforce policies, you could not get budget, and you could not even hire a staff. When does become a turning point? How long do you fight versus when do you give up and go? I often talked about, and we discussed about, the really big breaches that were in the news about, SolarWinds and Uber. And I guess, the one thing I kind of called out was, if ever your integrity is being questioned, or you are, being asked to overlook things, I think that's become a sort of a point of no return where you can no longer fight. It would be interesting to hear what you guys think. But yeah, how can you be held accountable for something that you are not empowered to prevent? So that's kind of the theme of this. So, and then it leads to, exit, the resignation effect immediately, and, it kind of goes into that story, over 18 months, you can warn about critical gaps, about the budget, and the breaches that could have been preventable, but they were overlooked. And obviously documenting the risks raised and ignored. And that's a really, I guess, difficult position to get to. I really think about, where I called out in the beginning, is that you can be equipped very well technically and be prepared for this role, but the hardest bit is actually, learning to storytell, learning to persevere, learning how to find other avenues. I even called out in one of the other posts, and I think everyone been witness to this, but you know, bringing weapons into your arsenal, such as, for example, external audit. Now, I'm sure many of us been in similar situations, but you can talk about specific controls or lacking controls and never getting anywhere. All of a sudden, you bring one of the big four, with a big name, and all of a sudden they do an audit and they say exactly what you said, and all of a sudden everything has been approved. However ugly that might be, but sometimes it's a weapon to be used in your arsenal where you get an external verification because you're not marking your own homework. But I think that goes into question whether you are trusted or not. But an interesting thing came about of this, and I got approached with various kind of people, but I'm really passionate about problems that we're facing in this industry. So the goal was to and I'm working with my colleague to help with understand how different people want to receive information, how to go against negative bias, how to become a great storyteller, how to translate cyber risks from technical to non-technical people, how to engage the audiences and things like that. So we're working on something exciting, so hopefully we can share something in the future. But I feel like it's not only about equipping the people with the right skills and knowledge, but I think at the same time is giving back people the time and preventing the burnout and the stress that people are currently facing in our industry. So hopefully something going to be very useful. But the story is once the resignation letter goes in, obviously the decompression timeline, the EO calls, the legal, obviously you answer the legal call and HR sends you the paperwork. But as I as we often discuss in industry, I think the biggest problem with whether it's stress, whether it's burnout, is that you normally don't notice until it's too late, and it's hard to notice the signals. And I often talk about, I think one problem with any probably leadership role or any time you start a new role, and I called out this the other day as well, that we want, whenever we walk into a new role, the goal is to impress people, is to show up and show what we can do. But answering an email at 11 p.m. one day, next day becomes an expectation. Whenever you need to be very clear from day one how you're going to set the boundaries and what is acceptable versus not. Because as I say, doing it once or twice, all of a sudden it becomes an expectation, and that is a very quick path to burnout and stress and not realizing before it's too late. So as the story says, obviously slept 12 hours, first time in 2 years, and felt human again. And, when I talked in the post, actually, we discussed a bit about, what are the paths and alternatives. I've seen many CISOs, I guess, not actually even probably looking to go back to the full-time sort of employment, or they're going back to VCISO world or fractional stuff where they get to dictate how things are going to work. You choose your clients, you choose how your work-life balance is going to work in the future. And as I say, sometimes walking away isn't failure, it's survival. But as I discussed, it's just knowing when's the right time to walk away and when it's not a right time to walk away. But as I've been kind of narrating this through the story, lessons for CISOs and sort of some of the interview red flags to think of, how long did the previous CISOs stay? Where did they leave? Can you speak to them? As I mentioned, how many CISOs you had in the last 5 years? If you are number 5, in 6 years, then run. What is the security budget as a percentage of IT budget? You want to have a clear expectations and clear direction from the business of where the program needs to go. If it's a vague, walk away. And and I think this is really important. As I always say, industry stuff right now. And I think you obviously I understand, people needing to pay bills and want to support their families, but you know, walking away probably into a role that's going to lead to stress burnout is probably not the right choice, even if you are able to pay the bills. So we need to find a way to look after ourselves and do better. Now, on the flip side, I think that we need to find a better way to educate businesses about the dirty secrets of cybersecurity. Businesses need to understand that, we can't patch everything, we can't fix everything. And, the importance of just good enough security for the risks the businesses face and the size of the business. The goal is obviously is not perfection. The goal is intelligent risk management, and mature organizations ignore the noise and focus on what matters. And I think wherever you are on that spectrum, you need to educate continuously the leadership across the board of what does it mean good enough security? What does it mean we're doing enough? How much investment we need to make in order to achieve our goals? I often talk about, I think, and the landscape is obviously changing. We've got AI obviously evolving rapidly, but, I often say that, 2010s was all about, preventing breaches. I think 2020s, we kind of realized that we can't prevent everything. So the goal is to improve resilience. The goal is to continue business operations while bad things are happening, and how we can do that. I've got only a couple of slides, so a couple more minutes, because I know sometimes I get to talk and talk too much, but this is of another story, and I think that, probably most of us been in similar shoes where you walk in the corridors of the office, and executive, a CISO, CFO, whoever it might be, stops you in a lift in a corridor and says, are we secure? And there's no really easy answer. Yes, you're being dishonest. No, it's career limiting. So I guess the right answer, as we kind of try to explain in this message, but it's something along the lines that we are appropriately secure for our risk profile, and we are protected against likely threats and monitoring for anomalies. And I think that this is the cue, sort of, where you can call out top two important gaps that you need addressing within budget constraints. Whenever questions these are posed, it often comes through famous breaches and stuff like that. I guess it's your cue to call out the gaps that you might have, and talk about how we can shore up those gaps, what investments we need to be made in order to do that. And the last bit is obviously changing the tide. Security is often supported verbally, but ignored financially, and I guess the main line is, and blamed eventually. Companies that don't value security, they don't deserve you. And if you're being set up to fail, it might be time to go. Your next role will be better, I promise. And I'm hoping that some of the work that I'm doing is going to allow more people to equip themselves with weapons and arsenal to prevent this from happening more often. And hopefully, through the messaging and through continuous work that we're doing, we can educate the boards and executives to understand the importance of cyber risk. Obviously, sometimes egotistically we think we are the most important. We're never going to be the most important, but we need to have enough importance for us to do the important work that we do. So thank you guys for listening. Hopefully this was useful. And, if you want to learn more, follow along. I'm sure there is you can find me on LinkedIn. And I'm happy to answer any questions and, provide any information you guys might want.
Marius, that's really incisive, very pertinent to what I know we've discussed ourselves, but no, really, I think you hit the nail on the head there. And we've got some questions. In fact, one of the questions, it says here, if you had to summarize the lessons learned from these stories in 3 to 5 points, maybe what could be done to avoid these situations in the future, what would that be? And I was thinking, actually, the summary might be, we as security professionals are always between a rock and a hard place, and you never get a good night's sleep. But sorry, that's me. So
Yeah.
what would you say your summary is?
Well, I think there's a couple of things to draw out. As I discussed, in here, I think it's very important to understand, again, every interview is a two-way street, and you need to do your homework. You know, I think sometimes, obviously, needing work puts you in a tough situation, but that doesn't mean that we should be walking in a place where might not be best for us. And then, understanding that relationship building and getting support across the business units is an important task that can't be neglected. I often talk about advice that, Keith Price from National Highways said, his first 90 days is not about, doing assessments or audits. It's about trying to help people across every business and understand how they can help them so he can call on those favors when he needs support for his security initiatives. And I think that's an important sort of lesson to call out, is build as many supporters that you might have. I often talk, for example, AI is here to stay. And if you are ever doubtful that you're getting enough support, we as CISOs normally quite well understand AI. So instead of blocking its adoption, lead its adoption, become the trusted AI advisor to the business. Then you'll learn or earn credibility and trust with the board, and that could be your gateway ticket. I often talk about even helping business solve other problems. For example, even now in my day job, I've got a great guy who's is very been proactive, and he learned Power Apps, Power Automate, and I've sent him around the whole business to improve automations, not in security, but in everywhere. Once we've done our task, he's working with FinOps, he's working with BD. We can help every business because we have technical abilities, knowledges that other business units might not have.
Excellent. Yes. So I wanted to pick up on a few of those things that you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a view that says we were fighting these battles 5, 10, 15 years ago? At that time, the battle was we were crying because we didn't have a position on the board or, in the top table or something like that. Now we're crying because it's not being funded enough. No one's being funded enough. Every function you look at are shorter resources. So what's special about you guys, you security people? It's the same sort of discussion that you had all this time ago.
Yeah, I think so in a way, yes. And that's what I'm saying. I think that the hardest part is because most of us came from fairly technical route. And I say all of a sudden, you are thrust in this business executive position, where, and I've seen someone, prominent sort of cyber influencers mocking CISOs who are crying, but, it's up to you. I was the same way. I all of a sudden came from being senior security engineer to given a role to build the whole cyber program. So my sort of development flipped 180 degrees. I went from reading technical books to reading books like Smartest Person in the Room, the FBI negotiating books and influencing books, about communication books. Because I thought that these skills going to be very important. How to empathize with people, how to understand and get into their own shoes, understand how various people want to be communicated to, because you can't communicate with one person the same way as you communicating to the other. So all of this skills and knowledge becomes very important, and you are not, most of the time you're not prepared for it, and having the right mentor and the right people around you, and being in the right communities. Because I often say your biggest asset in cybersecurity is the broad network you might build. I'm in various CISO groups of 500-600 people where so many people are willing to help and offer a helping hand. You just need to be able to reach them.
And I think that's the key, isn't it? Because when you are in these elevated positions, we as the CISO community, we actually have a lot of material, learning, webinars, podcasts, everything on the technical side.
Yeah.
But it's actually getting those soft skills, that soft power, really. How do you influence people? How do you make friends with senior people who get to see your side of the story? So you're not always having to start from, ground zero every time. We're actually able to influence people.
And I think that's probably where probably a trend or a gap we should address in the near future. Because if you say any dinner, any round table is all about, how AI does this or how we prevent this, it's all fairly technical. There's rarely ever you get a sort of an intimate event with prominent leaders who can showcase, various tactics to get your initiatives across the table. It's all of a sudden, thought as a given, but that's not, there are people who are introverted and not everyone has the same skills. And, and I often talk about, you need to be vulnerable and you need to step outside your comfort zone in order to build those skills.
Exactly. I think breaking that down step by step, how that is done, it's not something that is standard as CISO lessons. You have to actually dig for that kind of information.
Yeah.
As you said, link up with mentors who are in that position, who can do that sort of thing. But the other aspect you mentioned, actually being able to put a narrative around, a story around, how do you quantify that risk? Risk quantification, making sure that there is a line of sight between the investment that you make and the loss, the impact of the organization. I mean, that is something that everyone should be able to do. We should be able to do a proper business impact assessment, actually show the value of putting security in.
Yeah. And I think sometimes, we forget even, I actually just pulled out, my good friend who's a CISO at Anecdotes, who's a GRC platform, he actually pulled out this a couple of days ago saying, he was at SKO. And again, similar story, his sales team, they had great numbers, they knew everything about the product, but they couldn't tell a story. And, wherever you are, whether it's sales, whether, we as CISOs, in a way, we are still selling a solution to our business. So creating a narrative and a story. And I did the same thing. I was in Athens in SKO for another provider. And I talked about, I kind of shared my lessons about how salespeople should understand what CISO expects from the sales process. And I talked about stories, how can you narrate stories, instead of, quoting me product numbers and how quick your time to detect is, yes, it might be impressive, but tell me how your solution solves my problems for a story. That becomes really powerful.
We've got a question here. I don't know if you can see it on your Q&A. It says, surely documenting conversations and ensuring highlighted risks are raised and signed off by the accountable executive should help to strengthen your case as a CISO if you have raised issues that have been exploited and resulted in a breach.
There is an important word here. Should. It should, but it doesn't always work in practice. And the problem is sometimes it's getting them to sign off on these risks is one thing, but then again the problem is again and I often talk about risk management and risk sort of stuff is an evolving document. People might, throw away risks that are over a year old and things like that. So yes, documenting things is important, but I always say, it's, you can document and get people to sign off. But the problem is, again, if bad things happening and it's security related, you're going to be called upon, even though somebody else accepted the risk. So, it's about how do we build that narrative? Because some risks eventually, of course, they will be accepted, and documentation is going to be the most important document, and especially now in in this world where we are in US, we're talking about walking into liability courts and things like that. So it's going to be important like never before, and therefore I think sometimes an important point to note that, risk management needs to probably move away from living into Excel spreadsheets and actually get into some proper platforms where you can be tracked and continuously evaluated and assessed, instead of living on a spreadsheet.
We've got a question from Rob Shaw. Do you have any thoughts on the types of cyber content and experiences we can give our colleagues to make them truly memorable and impactful?
I think anything is impactful when it starts relating to home. Whenever you can get something relatable that happens outside of work, whenever, you talk about a story where, because of specific thing, how people been exploited, I often talk, for example, I'll give you a very simple example, and that's why sometimes it really pains me and saddens me how, people could listen to a bad advice. But, my good friend is from Southeast Cybersecurity Center, and they get to deal with various kind of concepts. But a lady called crying and bawling her eyes out. Her bank account has been cleaned out. First question, obviously, the guy said, have you turned on the MFA? She says, yes, I have. But my friend said she didn't believe in it and she told me to turn it off. And she did. And 24 hours later, her bank account was empty. And what would you say to that, people? Somebody told them that don't believe in MFA, therefore you should turn it off. And, these kind of stories really bring, truth home when how important is, simple things like MFA, especially on, when you can relate to, your family and friends. Because, I think, I don't remember where I was talking with someone where, tell me you are working in cybersecurity without telling me you in cybersecurity, and all your family comes to you with help desk questions, but, they ignore you on your security advice.
Very good. Yeah. Another point here, when we knowingly accept a security risk, how is that decision recorded? Who is explicitly accountable for it? And what conditions would automatically force it to be revisited or escalated?
I think that all depends on your risk management process. Normally, you would assign, and that's where the real key point is here to make as well. The risk should bubble up all the way to the top executive in their respective area. It should never be, signed off by a manager or something like that. It should go right to the very top to give it enough attention. But yeah, it should be, I often say similar to, whether it's pen testing, whether it's anything else, risks continuously evolve and change based on a landscape, based on your evolving business needs and threats. So therefore, you should have a fairly regular cadence how and when these things are evaluated. Point in time assessment, it shows you the risk, is X, Y, Z in, today. But if you're not evaluating for a year, that risk might have crept up, and all of a sudden, it could cause danger to the business. So it's important to, have at the top of your mind sort of, and I'm not talking all of it, but think about, top 5, top 10 should be always on your forefront of your mind, and you should have a plan what you're going to do about them.
Marius, can you say a bit more about, you mentioned burnout, health and things like that. And where can people go? Because again, this is another thing that I don't think it's well addressed, particularly in companies.
Yeah.
Where organizations should be responsible to their employees, but I just don't see enough of it. Other than, you can talk to, the external company that they might have got a contract with, do a bit of meditation, but what's your view on that? How do individuals, because we have to take that on board ourselves, each of us.
I think it's important to find an outlet. I often talk, obviously, I guess for everyone is going to be different, but for me, gym is the place to go. I probably would go quite crazy if I'm not consistently in a gym. And I think it's just, you need to find where you can sort of release and expend the energy and stress that, because it inevitably builds up. I think another point is, and I discussed with one of sort of leadership coaches recently, which she mentioned an important message. Sometimes vulnerability is an important point to make. You need to be comfortable to speak up when you're not okay and when you have too much on your plate. I think sometimes, sharing with your team when you are facing difficult times can be tremendously helpful and can be, because sometimes you might not even look human like because you're never going to share how you're feeling and what you are dealing with. So it can be really helpful because I often say, and I kind of probably narrate into this one story, but I think we are leaders sometimes are put ourselves in this predicament is because I've seen, people who really want to micromanage and to want to make every single decision. And the important point I always say, you hired a team for a reason. Let them do their work. So I'm very, proponent on building a cyber program, and I give domain responsibility and ownership to a single individual. So, I'll go a SecOps person that owns a SecOps domain of my cyber program, and he can build the SecOps domain how he sees fit. I'm there to help and guide him, but he owns that domain, and he, that's his responsibility and that's his baby. And that breeds an extra layer of accountability and drive because, people feel that they own parts of the program and they feel really enthusiastic and they can drive it forward. And I think, that really can help transform your team.
Two quick questions that have just come in. I know we're kind of just approaching the end of our session, but I think you might have already addressed this. How does a CISO strike the right balance between business go faster to market and IT is pushed to embed third-party modules into applications without adequate security due diligence? It's the same balance, really, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's all about understanding, innately what do these kind of third-party applications bring to the table and what risks they come. And, it can be really difficult, but, I often, for example, talk, whenever you start to transform your SDLC, you need to be able to get to sit down to the senior, development leadership and carve out some time. Because the problem is, whenever you say you're doing 2-week sprints, if they build story points for the 2 weeks, how are you going to get them to do any security work? So you need to be tactical about how you can carve up some story points every single sprint to assign executive or security, initiatives and roles. And I think I often talk about ownership. If developers don't, whenever we talk about, I think one thing I always mention is code quality. To me, code quality means security. So if you push, developers to build a quality code, security should form part of that quality. So they should be somehow measured on the output that they perform in terms of security. So unless you can build that accountability and responsibility, it's very hard to achieve any significant impact in that area.
And just a very last question. It's about AI. I'll just paraphrase it. So are you seeing a big increase in AI-based threats? Is that likely to be one of the biggest challenges for a CISO, do you think?
No, I don't think so. I think, I think AI is just, a marketing hype, even where, there was a recent article that said AI. I don't see any signs, and I have done a bit of research, there's limited signs. The only AI probably where you've seen is generation of phishing emails. But the only one which actually was really interesting and it's really worrying, I'll share a quick short story. We've been talking about APTs, but now there is a new upcoming trend, what is called AP teens. So groups like Scattered Spider are all teens. And the one big difference is, so for example, Russians will never attack Russian infrastructure. They only attack foreign nation states, same as Chinese, same as Koreans. Now, AP teens are formed of groups of Canadian, US, and UK teenagers who are English speaking and are not afraid to attack local infrastructure. And they use info stealers where they found, anywhere between 5 and 3 years old credentials. But what they are capable of, they're very good English speakers. So they will use AI to clone their voice to an 18-year-old girl, pull a help desk, and change the old password that they found from an info stealer. And that's a really powerful tactic. And there is no easy way to defend against that. And that's what we are currently facing with. And that's really, hard to. And AI is only the voice clone, but there's no sophisticated AI sort of 0-day attacks that's currently happening.
Excellent. We've gone over our time, so Marius, I just want to thank you so much. I think that's just been really insightful. We're definitely going to have you again. This is an ongoing conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and thank you everyone for joining. Sorry if your dinner is slightly later than we were intending. But thank you for joining, and please join us again next Tuesday when we have our next session from ISACA London chapter. Marius, thank you. Meryl, thank you. Everyone.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay, if you can just stop the presentation.